Hi everyone, this is BritSimon. A few people have asked me to try and explain what's going on with the Visa Bulletin and the progress that we're seeing, to try and explain how that works, which I've done in various videos before. I've explained how the numbers are set month to month. I think a lot of you might have the impression that they kind of divide up the numbers into 12 months and move, sort of in a mathematical way, like a mathematical calculation. And it's not like that. It's not, that doesn't describe how the process works. The process is based on a few factors. And the visa office has to take into account the embassy capacity for the region, the number of cases that they have that are processed and ready for interview. And based on that, they will move the visa bulletin number to a greater or lesser extent to reveal enough cases to use the capacity. Now, what can happen in some months is that they don't need to move the visa bulletin number very much at all. And we've just seen that, for example, in Asia. They didn't move the Asia number at all. And I've done a video on Asia just recently, and so I think that that should be fairly clear to people. If people have watched my video, they should understand the Asia visa bulletin numbers a little bit better, and they should understand why Nepal was moved up in terms of its number, whilst the rest of Asia was not moved up, right? So I'm hoping that people have a better understanding of Asia, and if you haven't, look at my recent videos and you'll gain a better appreciation of how the data will be laid out. The other comment that I would make before showing you a spreadsheet which tries to explain this, the other comment that I would make is that in January, on January the 1st, we're going to have the CEAC data, which is going to give us a lot more information than we currently have. So right now, I'm having to guess some of the things, and to be honest, I'm having to guess too much here. So this is highly speculative, but I think I can explain to you the process of the Visa Bulletin movement in the context of Africa. I'm going to explain Africa, and that will help you sort of understand what's going on with the numbers a little bit. Okay, so let me show you my screen. And maybe you should just pause the video at this point, go and get yourself a cup of tea or a coffee, because this is going to be a little bit of a complicated explanation. So I want to take this a little bit slowly and try and explain what's going on here, right? Okay, so let me show you some data. Now, I've just put this data together. So I'm hoping I'll work through it with you, and I'm hoping it's going to be clear what what's going to be going on here. Okay, so what I've done is this is for DV2024, and these are the Visa Bulletin numbers that were made available for each month of interview. So the first Visa Bulletin that affected DV2024 was published in August, and that set the Africa number, the region as a whole, at 10,000. That was then repeated. The 10,000 stayed in place at 10,000 for November, went up to 11,000 for December. It doubled and everyone got excited for January, went to 22,000, and then it's just gone to 26,500 in the latest Visa Bulletin, which is for February interviews, okay? So that's simple enough. That's the plot of the Visa Bulletin numbers, and I'm not considering the accept countries in this. They add a level of information to this that would just make this too complex to explain. So let's not take those countries into account. Now, the other thing that we need to know that I don't know is the case density. Now, I've given a prediction. I've showed you this one before. I've predicted what the case density will be for each of the regions. So for Africa, for example, my overall case number density projection is 27%. What I mean by that is 73% of the cases in Africa region will be holes, okay? However, those holes are not distributed evenly. There will be far fewer holes in the early number ranges and far more holes in the later number ranges, right? So if we're correct, and the reports we've had of case numbers going up to 122,000 for DV 2024, then what I did was, let me just explain this again. I know the number of selectees. We got 55,000 selectees. That represents a 12% increase over DV 2023, right? The high case number I just put in there for information was 63,502. That was the highest selectee number in DV 2023. And it did become current, just became current in the final month. In DV 2023, there were 29,335 cases for those 49,000 selectees, right? And so they had a case density overall of 46%, 46.2%. Okay, so 54% almost of the 63,000 case numbers that could possibly have been allocated, 54% were holes, right? But again, the distribution was not even. There were more holes later in the number range than there were in the beginning. And I've explained many times why that is, and hopefully you understand my explanation about holes, what I used to call holes theory. And I used to call it holes theory, by the way, because I introduced that concept in about 2013 or 2014. People didn't really understand that at all at that time. And so I called it holes theory, which is the same as saying gravity theory or the theory of evolution. These things are facts. Gravity and evolution are facts. We know them to be true. And in the same way that the holes theory we know to be true, but we call something a theory initially so that we can prove it in various different ways, right? Same with gravity, same with evolution and that sort of thing. Those things are accepted scientific facts, and the holes theory, we've got more than enough data now to say that everything I was saying back in 2013, 2014 about holes is true. And when you hear YouTubers today talk about holes, they've got that understanding from information I gave, 10 years ago, right? So that's the, there's no doubt about all of the holes understanding. Okay, so understanding how DV 2023 looked and how many cases there were in DV 2023, we then use the derivative rate to figure out how many case numbers there should be in DV 2024. There should be just under 33,000 cases. It's an approximation. It may not be exactly correct when we get the numbers, but if there's 33,000 cases, true cases in 122,000 case numbers or possible case numbers, then that leads to a density projection of 27%. That's what that means. That's how we get to that projection. Okay, now 27% is the overall range. That means there's going to be a much higher density in the beginning, much lower in the later ranges. We could see density in the highest case numbers, let's say above 100,000. It might go down to like 10% of density, which means there's only 100 real cases for every 1,000 case numbers. It could be as low as that, okay? In the beginning, though, I'm going to assume that it must be at least 50%. And so we'll say half of the case numbers between 1 and 26,000 or 26,500 are going to be real cases. That's just an assumption I'm making. And so I've put the case density here in this column, and I've continued it all the way down to case number 26,500. At some point, there will be country cutoffs that will start to reduce that case density and increase the number of holes. And we'll see that in a few minutes. We'll go through that in a few minutes. So case density is important to understand what's happening with the Visa Bulletin. The other thing that's important is how many of the DS260s have been processed. When they start the process of releasing the numbers for the October interviews, that happened back in August, right? So the only cases at that time that were processed were very early submissions of DS260s with very simple cases. Single people would normally go first because they're easier to process, not because they're prioritized in some way. It's simply that when you open a DS260 and you've got a family of 7, that family of 7 could take longer to process than a family of 1, right? And so very often we hear rumors at the beginning of the year. I chuckle because it shows a sort of a lack of understanding. But at the beginning of the year, you'll hear these rumors that, oh, they're preferring single people. And you know, that's how DS260 processing works. They're preferring single people. No, it's simply that those cases are easier to process. And so in August and September, there would have been a low number of DS260s processed as an overall, right? The other bad rumor that you'll hear occasionally is that DS260s are processed in numerical order. That's not true. There are plenty of cases that I can point you to of people with case numbers in the 60,000s, 80,000s, and so on, who've had their cases processed already. They're nowhere near current. They won't be current for months to come, right? But their DS260 has been processed because they opened the cases in submission order. And then they process them at varying rates depending on how complex that case is, both in terms of the individual applicant and how many applicants there are on that one case, right? Okay. So I've had to make some assumptions here, and I've said, okay, there's probably only 30% of the cases that were processed for the October interviews. And let's say that number increases by 10%. So 40% of cases by November, 50% of cases by December, 60% by January, and 70% by February. And I'm gonna speculate here, but I think that we probably now this is a 2-month lagging indicator, right? So when I should just cover that when we talk about how many cases are going to be processed by February, we really mean the cases processed in December, because that's the time when they're doing the math to figure out how many cases they should reveal in the Visa Bulletin. So there is a 2-month difference between the numbers we're seeing here and what it really means in terms of the Visa Bulletin calculation. Okay. So I think they're going to be finished in processing DS260s around about January or February. February will be, so February processing, let's say, will be for April interviews. And let's just as a sort of protection here, I've said, okay, let's say they get to 100%. I mark it as 99%. I'll come to it in a minute. But they get to 100%, but let's say they finish all the DS260s processing by March, right? Now that's later than a normal year. Why is it later? Well, because they selected 140,000 people, right? So that means they're going to get a lot of DS260 submissions, more than they're used to getting. That means it's going to take longer to process those cases, right? So so let's say it goes on till February or March. That will mean that by April or May, we should see every case has been processed. And from that point onwards, there will be some people who submit very late. Some people will submit in March and April, and perhaps even May. And so that's why I leave the DS260 process number at 99%. It just is to show that a case could come in at that point, be submitted, let's say in May, and it will be processed in about 2 weeks' time, typically 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer if there's a complex case. But literally within a couple of weeks, you'll see DS260s being processed for people that submit very late, okay? Not that I'm suggesting to do that, I'm just saying what will happen. Okay, so, and why do they operate like this? Well, of course, the other thing is that come May, they're going to start getting DS260 submissions for next year for DV2025. So they really want to, KCC really want to get this work out of the way by May, right? Because by May, they're starting to get those additional DS260s. And so that's why this work, it looks like they're going to finish the work too early. Why are they doing that? Well, it's because they've got to be ready for the next year, right? The processing goes 6 months ahead of the next year, essentially. Okay, so hopefully you're still with me. You're understanding a little bit about case density. You're understanding about DS260 processing, right? Now let's put those numbers together. Let's consider how many cases were available for interview from the case numbers that were made current, right? So in October, there were 10,000 case numbers made current with a case density of 50%. That means there were 5,000 real cases, if my assumption is correct. But only 30% of those 5,000 real cases were available or ready for interview. So 1,500 cases were available for interview, or they could have been available for interview, right? The embassy capacity was probably something, and I'm guessing this number, but let's say it was about 1,000 interviews were made available by the embassies. That means that there would have been a backlog generated in that very first month of 500 cases, right? If we then look at the next month, and they didn't increase the number at all, right? But they would have had the same density. Same density would have been 50%. But now they've got more DS260s processed, and so a total of 2,000 people could have been available for interview, right? Even though the 10,000 didn't increase, the DS260 submission and processing percentage increased. So now we got an extra 500 people that could be interviewed. And don't forget, there was a backlog from the previous month. So that was actually quite nicely done. If my numbers are correct here, the embassy capacity was 1,000 again. And that means that they managed the Visa Bulletin well by not increasing the number. They didn't need to increase the number because 500 cases were already ready to be scheduled, but hadn't been scheduled in the month of October, right? That's kind of what it means. Now, in December, they increased very little, but they increased to 11,000, but the number of DS260s processed was 50%. So there was a total of 2,750, or an extra 750 cases revealed from the numbers, right? And that meant that they would have had more capacity by that time than for December interviews than they needed. Okay. Now they did a big jump to 22,000 for the January interviews. 50% density means that there would have been 11,000 cases in that 22,000 number, and 60% of those 11,000 would have been processed. So that's 6,600 cases are now capable of being interviewed. All right. Now, let's say they set the capacity for January at 1,500. The problem there is that they created a backlog of 2,000 cases. Okay. But by this time, we know there is a backlog at some of the embassies that are not working well. There are a few embassies that are probably not working well. And those embassies probably account for the major part of the backlog. But there is a backlog developing there. Okay. And as they go through to 26,500 with 50% density, then again, there would have been an increase in the number of cases processed. Another 10% would have been processed because it's another month. And that reveals 9,275 cases that are available for interview, right? Giving us now a cumulative backlog of 3,275, okay? So I'm hoping you understand this so far. I'm trying to explain why they don't need to increase the numbers very much sometimes to achieve the result they want. Now let me then start to speculate for you, to try and sort of draw some pictures about what could happen next. Okay, I'm going to assume that we're going to hit our first country cutoff and see a reduction of the density down to 45% for the month of March, right? And I'm going to further decrease that by a few percent each month here. We'll go down to 40% in April. We'll go down to, let's say, 30% in May. We'll get down to, let's say, 20% in June, and we'll keep that at about 20% from that point forward, because I don't think we're going to get to the highest case numbers, right? I think we're going to get it. I don't think we're going to go to 122,000 realistically. Depends on the behavior of the embassies, of course, but this is going to be the way that I'm going to explain things, right? Okay, so now we can say, okay, let's pump in some numbers here. Let's say they put the next visa bulletin, and this is pure speculation. I don't want you to hold me to this. This is just speculation. But let's say they move that to 30,000. That would mean by that time that we can pump in some numbers here. The backlog would remain at 33. Ignore these minus numbers for the time being. The backlog would remain at 33,000. Let's say they increase to 35,000 the month of April. Backlog still increased, right? Because I increased it by another 35,000 there. But if I increase by another 40, up to 40,000 in May, then you can see the backlog is starting to come down. Okay. And now I'm going to increase by a full 10,000 to 50,000 in June. And there's extra capacity. So actually, because of the density here, they could have gone to 60,000, let's say. And that would be more or less right. Okay. And let's say they then go to 80,000 for, this is backlog number here. That was too many. So we'd try 70,000. That's about right. So 70,000 by July. And then we'll try 80,000 for August. That's close. It's a little bit high, perhaps. So maybe we go to 78 or 77,000. 78,000. Try that. Yeah, so it's about right. And then finally, maybe they get to 85,000 as a case number. And that means that the total cumulative capacity of cases scheduled would be 16,500 for the year. And this is based on a very, very, very random density projection here. I really don't know if that's true. We know that there's going to be backlog in some of the embassies. That backlog could easily stay high if the embassies don't work well. There's all sorts of problems with this model, but you can begin to see how things could work. And you can create your own spreadsheet and do a very similar exercise to do your own projections. But you'll note that I'm not trying to suggest that we're going to get to 120,000 by September interviews. And in order to get there, we need massive disorganization at significant number of the embassies. We've already seen better operation from Nairobi embassy, for example, that was a bad performer in DV2023. And so just having like one or two embassies that were bad performers last year, but good performers this year, really means that several thousand more people can go through that embassy, and it will improve the operation of Africa as a whole, right? So I know somebody's gonna say, "Oh, these are your predictions." Then these are not really my predictions. These are just illustrations of how the number ranges can go. I don't know yet, and we will see on January 1st what the case density will look like. And so we'll come back and we'll have a look at these numbers in 3 weeks' time when we know what the case density looks like. And when we know the case density, then we can actually make some reasonable predictions, although we don't know how the embassies are going to behave and how the bad behavior is going to continue through the year. But we will know how the embassies, all of the embassies, have performed in October, November, December. We'll know that on January the 1st, right? We'll know what cases they've taken. We only know October numbers at the moment. We'll have November numbers probably in a couple of weeks' time, and then we'll have all of the data right up to date to the end of December on January the 1st, okay? So don't get too freaked out about these predictions. These are not my real predictions. We don't know these numbers. I don't know the case density. The case density could be higher or lower than what I'm suggesting here. We don't really know that. And the DS260 processing speed and the ramp up of the DS260 processing here is, again, it's speculation. It's based on some historical analysis, but it is speculation. I don't really know for a fact that's going to be that way. I also am speculating about the capacity, but again, that's based on what I've seen happen in the past in the Africa region. Okay, so it could go above or below these numbers, and as we get the data, we'll begin to be able to plot the actual month-to-month capacity against these numbers and see whether the capacity is increasing or not. We'll actually be able to see month by month how many visa interviews or interviews were scheduled, how many cases were scheduled month to month. So we'll be able to plot that against this. The most active months that I've seen for Africa, I think, have had about 2,000 interviews. I don't think we've seen 3,000 for Africa in a month. Perhaps we might have done in 22 or 23 when they were really trying to do things crazy. But generally, that sort of capacity doesn't exist without an extreme effort by all of the embassies, not just not just some of them. Okay, so I'm hoping. I'm hoping that this data was interesting, and that your understanding of how the Visa Bulletin is moved is a little bit better now, that you can see, particularly in these early months, how things were operated. And then this backlog, we'll have to wait and see if the backlog is real. We'll know that better in January. We'll be able to see. We'll look at the data in January. We'll be able to see the distribution of the cases. We'll have the density per thousands for the cases that are current at that point. And we'll be able to know the density for future case numbers, right? We'll be able to look at and approximate how many cases have been processed for each of the months, because we'll see this number increasing each month. So we'll be able to sort of see if this model actually works. But I've done predictions in this way before, and I used to be pretty accurate at it. I mean, I was accurate within a few hundred numbers. I was able to predict the Visa Bulletin within a few hundred numbers per region. Having said that, that was back in the days when things worked well. And so, that's why I've stopped doing predictions for some years now, because it's just the system has not been worked well since 2019, actually, before COVID. It then took a terrible hit, obviously, in COVID times. But even before COVID, it started to go wrong because partly because Trump was in office, but also because they introduced the document requirement that came in DV 2019, and that really screwed things up for a while. And they did other things like the DS 5535 processing, which slowed things down. They've done some things which have affected the processing of the program in general. So the last year that I think was a well-organized year was DV 2018. And since DV 2019 and onwards, it's not been well organized. and therefore difficult to predict what they are doing in the Visa Bulletin. There's also been a change of the operation in terms of management of the Visa Bulletin itself. So there are new managers in charge. It used to be Charlie, at the Department of State, but now there's a different person in charge. And so I think the math will still work the same way, but we would have to see. I actually did have an email conversation with Charlie that used to do the Visa Bulletin numbers. I had an email conversation with him some years ago, and he confirmed my theories of how he assesses the numbers. So I've got the understanding directly from the guy that used to do it. So and also we've seen evidence of that process in place, so we know how it works. And it isn't simple math in terms of, okay, they're going to, they doubled the number last month, therefore they're going to double it again this month. No, that's not how it works. Or they increased by 11,000 last month, so they'll increase by 11,000 this month. Again, that's not how it works. And we've just seen that in the latest Visa Bulletin. So it will have confused some, but hopefully with this information, you may be less confused. Some of you might be more confused now. Anyway, I hope that was interesting to you. Please let me know. Give me some comments on this video. I'd be very interested to know whether you've understood this, whether I've explained it properly. We might need to revisit the topic when we've got some more real data. But I'd be interested in hearing from you. Let me know your comments. As ever, please give me a thumbs up on the video if you liked it. Please subscribe to the channel. Please make sure you get your information from a logical and experienced source. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.